I'm gonna lay down my burdens down by the riverside, down by the riverside, down by the riverside. I'm gonna lay down my burdens down by the riverside to study war no more. Well, I ain't gonna study war no more. Study war no more. Study war no more. No more, no more. I ain't gonna study war no more. Study war no more. When all God's children get together, we're going to lay our burdens down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. When all God's children get together, we're going to lay down our sword and our shield down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. When all God's children get together down by the riverside, we're going to lay down the barriers of ethnicity and nationality, and we ain't going to study war no more. All of God's white children are going to get on one accord with God's black children, and God's white children and God's black children are going to get on accord with all God's other children, Native American and Asian and Indian, Chinese and Japanese and Filipino and Eskimo and Korean and Samoan and Vietnamese and Hawaiian and Guatemalan and Mexican and Puerto Rican and Cuban and mulatto, and all God's other children are going to get together down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. And when all God's children get together down by the riverside, we're going to lay down our political affiliation and our philosophical ideation, and we ain't going to study war no more. God's Republican children are going to get together with God's Democrat children, and God's Republican and Democrat children are going to get together with God's independent children. Then those on the left and those on the right, and those right of the center and those left of the center, and those in the middle of the road are all going to get together. And then the radicals and the conservatives and the moderates and the liberals will all follow suit. And not far behind will be the realists and the pessimists, the atheists and the agnostics, the idealists and the existentialists. All of us, we're all going to get together down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. And when all God's children get together down by the riverside, we're going to lay down our theological position and our denominational disposition, and we ain't going to study war no more. Down by the riverside, all God's Protestant children will get together with God's other children, the Baptists and the Anabaptists and the United Methodists and the African Methodists and the Primitive Methodists and the Lutherans and the Episcopalians, the Presbyterians and the Unitarians, the Congregationalists and the Universalists, the Zwinglians and the Anglicans, the Pentecostals and the Jehovah's Witnesses and the non-denominationalists, the agnostics and the atheists. All of them are going to get together down by the riverside, and then we're really going to have some church, and we ain't going to study war no more. And all God's children are going to get together, the Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox, the Greek Orthodox and the Russian Orthodox, the Coptics and the Roman Catholics and the Anglo-Catholics. All of them are going to get together down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. Then all of God's Protestant children are going to get together with God's Catholic children, and the Protestants and the Catholics are going to get together with all of God's other children, the Buddhists, the Hinduists, the Muslims and the Baha'i, the Shinto and the Taoists, the Confucianists and the Buddhists, the Sikhism and the Jainism, the Wiccans and the Muslim. And all of them are going to get together down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more. And when all of God's children get together down by the riverside, and we ain't going to study war no more, when the haves get together with the have-nots, when the powerful get together with the powerless, when the hopefuls reach out to the hopeless, when the saints stand with the apes, when the famous embrace the infamous, we ain't going to study war no more. When all God's children get together down by the riverside, we're going to lay down the barriers of race and ethnicity and nationality. We're going to lay down political affiliation and philosophical ideation. We're going to lay down a theological position and denominational dispositions. And we're going to lay down our burdens, and we're all going to lay down our sword and our shield way down by the riverside. And we're going to lay them down, and we ain't going to study war no more. And when studying war no more is no longer a possibility, we will pick up the very things that we've laid aside. And when we have picked up the things that we have laid aside, the former wars or weapons of our warfare, they will become transformed into instruments of understanding, and they will be transformed into instruments of individuality. And then with our instruments and understandings and our individuality blaring loudly, all God's children with their idiosyncrasies and their diverse personalities will try on their starry crown, try on their long white robe, and we ain't going to study war no more down by the riverside. Good morning. The topic of my presentation is unconscious bias. I have a few questions for you. And an unattractive person will always be hired before a less attractive person, but equally qualified. True or false? Well, studies show that people are more likely to earn 3 to 4% more if they are physically attractive according to stereotypical definitions. Referees only call calls based on the rule of the game. True or false? Well, studies show that referees are more apt to call fouls against players when they officiate games when they're calling against a player of their own race. True or false? Thin people are more likely to be hired than heavier weight individuals. Studies show that heavyweight people are more often disqualified from being hired and are less often nominated for supervisory positions. These findings are most pronounced in obese females. So what is implicit bias? Implicit bias are thoughts and feelings outside of our conscious awareness and control. It's a positive or negative mental attitude towards a person, thing, or group that a person holds at an unconscious level. It was once said that we are either unaware of or mistaken about the source of our thoughts and feelings. Implicit bias is pervasive. Everyone possesses them. Even people who are personally committed to impartiality and doing the right thing. Judges who preside over court proceedings are expected to be impartial, but they have implicit bias. Implicit bias is different from explicit bias, though they are related. If we do not address the implicit bias, they will show up in our actions and our tangible behavior. And so we all do it. I do want to emphasize, though, that implicit biases are not necessarily aligned to our personal belief or even reflect our stance that we would endorse explicitly. What am I saying? You might believe that you are a good person and try to do the right thing and treat everybody correctly, but still exhibit implicit bias on a subconscious level. I can't be biased. I have a lot of good black friends. I can't be racist. I gave to the United Negro College Fund. I can't be prejudiced. My gay friends always tell me how to put my colors and my clothes together. Muslims don't scare me. I just don't want to ride on an airplane with them. Implicit bias always tends to favor our own in-group. The research has shown that we can hold implicit bias even within our own group and our own membership. This is called confirmation bias. We like people who are like ourselves. We associate with people who look like ourselves, and we hire people for jobs and give honors to individuals who are like ourselves. The majority of hired managers in America are males. It's no surprise then that males constitute the predominantly sector of the workforce. The majority of hiring managers in America are white. Then it's no surprise then that persons of color are less likely to be hired in America. So you need to understand that even people within a group themselves can buy into the notion of inferiority or superiority. For instance, women might have bias against other women and say, I want to be supervised by a man, assuming that a man can supervise better. By the same token, other minorities or people of color might discriminate against other minorities based upon their implicit bias. Implicit bias captures the association between our social groups and stereotypes about that social group. Unconsciously, we react to people based upon the stereotypes of that group. There's a stereotype that women are not good decision makers. Wow, so unconscious bias in staff meeting may play out when a man takes the opinion of the other men rather than women. There's a stereotype that LGBTQ plus people are more promiscuous. So that plays out when we have attitudes towards them and do not want to be close to them for fear that they might hit on us. So our attitudes and our preferences are also capture the association between the social group and how we evaluate them based upon stereotypes. Again, we're talking about bias that happens below the surface of our conscious existence. Consider this, less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall. However, almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Less than 4% of American men are 6 feet tall, 2 inches, 6 feet 2 inches tall. However, more than 36% of corporate CEOs are over that height. Similar generals and admirals in the military and presidents of the United States of America have all been above average height individuals. The last elected president who was below that level was William McKinley, and even the media ridiculed him as the little boy. Why does this happen? Clearly no one advertised, let's get the tall guy for the job. But there's something that happens subconsciously whereby we associate leadership ability and talent and strength more so with height. Well, if that's the case, then I'm underpaid because I am 6 feet 4 inches tall. Now, it seems not only unfair but absurd to choose a CEO because of height. In the same way that it seems absurd that you would prescribe medical procedures to individuals based upon their race. However, studies show that people of color are more apt to be prescribed unnecessary surgical procedures that could be avoided, such as knee replacement, hip replacement, and even the removal of a limb. People of color are less likely to be treated immediately if they go to the hospital and say, I have chest pain. They're less likely to perceive or be prescribed pain medications if they say they are hurting. In the same manner, it would seem absurd to treat people differently because of their clothing, or the clothing they wear, or to call on boys more so than girls in class, but it happens. Now, bias is prejudice, a prejudgment in favor of or against one thing, person, or group compared with another, usually in a way that is considered to be unfair. Bias may be held by an individual, group, or institution and can have negative or positive consequences. Unconscious bias or implicit bias is when this happens below the surface and we are unaware. So then there are three types of bias. There's bias, which I've just defined. There's conscious bias, which is also known as explicit bias. And then there's unconscious bias, also known as implicit bias. Unconscious bias are social stereotypes regarding age, race, gender, etc. that we form outside of our own conscious awareness. We all hold unconscious bias and beliefs about various social groups and identities. The bias comes from the tendency of the human brain to group and to categorize people, to make us be able to make quick judgments about them. We all do it. Someone walks into the room and we've put them into a box. That's human nature. Unconscious bias is more pervasive than conscious bias. Surprisingly, unconscious bias may be incompatible and inconsistent with our personal values. As professionals, we may value diversity and understand the importance of hiring the most qualified candidates. However, when evaluating and screening applicants, unconscious bias comes into play. We automatically group and categorize people. When it comes to hiring, unconscious bias shows up in unconscious ways and below the surface ways, and how we write the job description, and where we place the advertisement, and how we review the applications and the resumes, how we write and review and evaluate letters of recommendations. Also, it shows up in how we connect with one applicant versus another. It shows up in who's invited for the interview versus who's not, and who we hire versus who we do not hire. Now allow me to put my professor hat on for a moment. Research has been done on this topic of unconscious bias. In a study entitled Stereotypes and Standards of Judgment, people were given pictures of men and women of the same height. Then the individuals were told to estimate the heights of them. They overestimated the height of men and underestimated the height of women. In a similar study, individuals were given the same written blurb. When they were told the blurb was written by an African American, they rated it lower. When told it was written by a white person, they rated it higher. When told that a woman wrote it versus a man, they rated it higher. In an article entitled, "Are Emily and Greg More Employable Than Lakeisha and Jamal?" researchers sent dummy resumes, the same resumes, to employers in Chicago and Boston. They randomly assigned white-sounding names versus African-American sounding names to the same resume. Applicants with white-sounding names received more callbacks for the interview. Applicants who possess the same qualifications with white-sounding names receive more callbacks than blacks. Applicants who possess the same qualifications, sometimes better qualifications, who had African-American sounding names were not called back as often. Now, more research. Women are more likely than men to make it to the short list for the job but not be hired. Women are less likely than men to be hired for the same job. Women are held to a lower standard when it comes to getting on the short list, but a higher standard when it comes to getting on the long list and eventually being hired. Still, there's more research. Research examined 312 letters of recommendation that had been written for medical faculty who were successfully hired at a large U.S. medical school. When they looked at the letters, they found that women versus men, there were some things that happened. The letters of recommendation for women were shorter. They were written with more minimal assurances. There were more gender terms in the letters for the women versus the men. There were more doubt raisers. Men were frequently referred to as researchers and women and colleagues, and women were called teachers and or students. The women were 4 times more likely to have references to their personal lives in their letters of recommendation, and fewer standout adjectives like excellent. Now, educationally, implicit bias shows up everywhere: in the education system, in the criminal justice system, in firing and hiring and selection processes. It shows up in how we discipline people, how we evaluate employees. Now, I have an experiment for you. You're walking in a public park, and you see someone with a pair of bolt cutters trying to cut off the chain of a bike. Now, what would your reaction be? Would you consider this person to be the thief, or would you consider this person to be the owner of the bike? I'm going to show you some pictures, and for each picture, you have to decide thief or owner. Let's go. Is this the thief or the owner? Make your decision quickly. Don't hesitate. Decide quickly. Is this the thief or the owner? Thief or 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 owner? And now I want to show you a video that captures the experiment that I just talked about. I want to get your reaction to this video. Wrap this up. by asking you some true-false questions. You decide true or false. True or false? If a black person and a white person are accused of the same crime, they have an equal chance of getting convicted. Studies have shown that with at least one black member in a jury pool, conviction rates were almost identical for blacks and whites. Without that black person on the jury, however, we find that blacks more often were convicted of a crime. True or false? If a boy or a girl are convicted of the same crime, they should get the same jail sentence. Well, studies show that men receive 63% longer sentences than women do. And women are twice as likely to avoid incarceration altogether. True or false? If a 60-year-old and a 22-year-old are convicted of the same crime, the 60-year-old should receive a shorter sentence. Well, studies show that individuals aged 21 to 25 receive a harsher sentence than those who are older. Offenders aged 50 and above receive the most lenient sentences in America. That's true. What am I saying? Unconscious bias is everywhere. We all do it. We all have it. Men, women, people of color, people not of color, heterosexual individuals, members of the LGBTQ plus community. We all do it. Those of us that are American, those of us that are international. We all engage in what is known as unconscious bias. The first step is to recognize that I do this and be willing to work on yourself. So the first step is to say, yeah, I've got bias, you've got bias, all God's children have bias. So the first step is to admit that. Believe it or not, culturally confident people in our society do not become sensitive by simply studying the cultures of others. They become sensitive by studying themselves and understanding their own tendencies, who they are and how they think and what they bring to the table, and admitting that, yes, I may make decisions subconsciously and consciously that are unfair towards others. So step number one is to begin to admit it. Step number two is to begin working on it. Study, read. Not only that, attend trainings such as this that will help you realize what the tendencies are and how to deal with them. And then number three, I would say, always have a good circle of friends and individuals, a diverse circle of friends and individuals. And don't be afraid to let them help you see things that you don't see about yourself. So always remain in conversation. In our society, we must continue to talk about differences and embrace differences. And when you put yourself in a group of individuals where you can have those kinds of conversations, you're on your way to laying your burden down by the riverside. Because after all, when all God's children get together down by the riverside, we ain't gonna study war no more. Thank you now.